by dealing with Mike alone. Right? And that's how a lot of families do this. Right? You've got a problem person in the family. So I'm going to shut that door for us. Yeah, thank you, John. All right, so you got a problem child in the family. One of the possibilities is you just shift that child off to counseling, right? Some kind of therapy, some kind of boarding school, psychological setting, right? Now, cybernetic model says, all right, maybe, but you also ought to look at the question of, is there a whole way in which everybody is involved in creating this? That Mike's behaviors are not just defined by who Mike is, but they're defined by his place in this family and the rules and the patterns of communication that exist within this family. So if you were a family dealing with this, someone might say to you, well, let's put Mike in, in this psychologist's practice, and have the psychologist. Or they might say, well, let's look at your whole family and let's look at the way the rules and the patterns that govern the way your family relates. And this is what they did down in Washington area. There was a fellow who said, I'm going to stop treating people as individuals and I'm only going to treat families. He said, I'm only going to do therapy with the whole family. I will not do individual therapy with a person. Because it's a result of the whole interaction pattern that's going on. And so we'd want to look at that question. So, for instance, one of the common things that cybernetics people see is the idea that people, and I've got to change these because I've got this wrong, Mike, and this is Stan, and this is Sonia. One of the common things that in interaction patterns that people who study things this way see is that if two people are having a problem, they will always try to bring in a third person to stabilize the situation for them.
Like a therapist?
Well, it could be a therapist, or it could be a friend, or it could be a common enemy. So let's say, in this case, that Stan and Sonia don't get along. Let's say they're having some problems getting along. They can't talk to each other, they're angry with each other, they're not communicating very well with each other. So what can happen then is that they can take that part of their relationship not working, and they can transfer it to somebody else in the system. They can displace their problem onto somebody else in the system. So now all of a sudden they've been having problems, but all of a sudden Mike starts having trouble, and now they get along with each other. Why do they get along with each other now? They get along with each other because they have something in common to worry about. They're both worried about Mike now. And so their problem has gone away. Now, the problem is not that they have a bad relationship. What's the problem? Mike is the problem. So in counseling language, we say Mike becomes the identified patient in this setting. Mike becomes the one identified, but one of the amazing things that exists here is that if these two people managed to fix things in their relationship, if they manage to make it that they didn't need Mike to be a problem,
She said, we're in Fox.
it sometimes can happen that he'll stop being a problem when they don't need him to be a problem anymore. That as part of this system, he's functioning to relieve the anxiety in their relationship. So a normal, a psychologist's way of doing it says, okay, let me deal with Mike and see if I can fix Mike. Family systems approach, interaction approach would say, let me see if your relationship improves, maybe his behavior will change. Because everything in the system is input and output. Everything is affecting everything else in the system. Does that ring bells for anybody? Does it make sense to you as a possibility? I mean, think about this with your own friends. You know, maybe you've had a friend that you had for a long time, and then you start not getting along with each other. But then all of a sudden you find somebody else that both of you don't like, and now your relationship works again. Right? Because you're now both focused on that person instead of the lack in your own relationship. And this is why you'll hear couples, you'll hear people sometimes say this, that we had a child to save our marriage. I don't know if you ever heard those things. Right? Yeah, well, that's this thing. What that means is we can't manage our own relationship. So we need some other part of a system. We need a new part in the interacting setting so that we don't have to deal with each other. We can deal together with this. So right, so that's, and I would encourage you to think, right, that doesn't work so good, because eventually that child wants to become an independent person. They want to grow up and be, but the system doesn't want to let them go because they need that to be okay, and so they try to keep the child in the system.
That's exactly my parents.
You don't have to tell us who it is. Yeah, so, but this is a problem. This is and from a cybernetic perspective, it makes sense. We can identify that there's a system of interacting parts, that there is the desire to establish a stability, which leads to certain patterns that exist, and that if there's any adaptation that's going to go on, like this child is going to grow up and become independent, it's going to throw the system into some kind of a chaos or a response. And often the response of the system is to try to get the person or the other part back into behaving the way it has been. And so it's a push. So in this situation, let's say we had a child to save our marriage, and now the child's growing up, and the child's trying to separate. What kind of messages would these parts possibly send in order to prevent the system from shifting? What kind of words, what kind of messages might be heard in order to change the behavior of a child who's beginning to become autonomous or their own person?
Fill them with I love yous.
What's that? Okay, it could be a lot of, we're feeling far from you. You've got to come spend more time with us. Or don't dare move away. If you move away, we won't know what to do, you know. We need you. There's a good word, right? We need you. You can't go. So the messages are exchanged in order to balance the system. So the message says, we need you, don't go away. The expected response is, okay, I'll spend more time, I won't go away. Okay, now we're balanced, so we can cut off the messages. So the messages, see, a cybernetic perspective says messages are used to reestablish stability in a system. So if you hear a message, you say, what is the function of that message? So you're asking the question, what is this message trying to do for this system? Because it's a complex group of interacting parts. There's inputs that become outputs. All right. Any quick thoughts? This should ring true. I mean, this is pretty common to life, you know. This is the way things go. Another way to do this is to look for triangles, to ask, well, what are the things that are allied together against another third thing? You know, and so you might have, and this is, and I've got to change this mic. You might have Stan and Sonia and Lori who are having a fight with Mike, right? They're having tension with Mike. So how does Mike manage that tension with his parents? He establishes a relationship with friends, right? And then the parents are all upset at the friends too. So there are two parts in and one part out. Mike and his friends against the family. So it's always, you can always look for the two parts that are in and the one part that's out that stabilizes the system. So now we're all, Mike and his friends are against, and they can talk about, yeah, how bad parents are, and parents are this and parents are that. No, they're too. So now we're stabilized, and we've pushed them to the outside. Does anybody see any problems with this? Anybody see any possible issues that this can, right?
You're often taking the focus off a troubled relationship and redirecting it on something else. Kind of taking the heat off yourself and putting it on somewhere else, knowing what's really going on.
Okay, so it's a way of taking the heat off you, which means then that you don't have to figure out how to do this. So in a sense, you are not going to grow, mature, learn, become healthier if you use this. You're going to grow, mature, become healthier as you learn to deal directly with the things you're having issues with, instead of avoiding it by putting something else into the system. Right? So you're going to have, so part of the goal, what is he doing over there? Okay. All right. All right. So, all right. Now, here's something else I want to show you in this system. So, Griffin makes the point that if Mike got better, you remember this in the chapter, Griffin makes a point, if Mike's behavior gets better, what does he think will happen here?
Somebody else have a problem?
Yeah, Griffin predicts that if Mike were to act better, that Lori would start to have problems. Now, does that ring true for you at all? I mean, this has been observed in family systems, that if we're all stabilized around the fact that Mike is a problem, and we all can talk to each other about, oh, we're so worried about Mike, and what's going to happen to Mike, and what are we going to do about Mike? All of a sudden, Mike gets better. What does that do to the way we've been interacting, the patterns of our interaction?
They have nothing else to talk about.
We have to change. if we don't think carefully about making that adjustment, we now need something new to talk about, or some new problem in the system. And so family systems analysis and cybernetics says somebody will do that. Somebody will function in that way.
And then like try and find something wrong.
So that the system will restabilize around the unhealth or scapegoating one part of the system. And
will they just keep scapegoating like the children instead of dealing with their own issues?
it might change, they could triangle, they might unite together against the mother. They might find some reason that all of us think she's unreasonable, think she doesn't spend enough time with us or whatever. Now we've got ourselves all together, we're all stabilized because this one is on the out. Yeah, so it could be all different ways.
How would you take into account, like, God forbid the kid became, like, really, really sick? Like, would they account for, like, the couple trying to pull together for the kid, or, like, is there something in relation to that? Or, like,
Well,
something happens to the mom or something, you know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, then the system would have to shift.
Right.
Yeah, let's say, right, God forbid something happens. So she gets sick with cancer and she dies.
Mm-hmm.
The system, well, these things happen, right? So the system, Mike might all of a sudden get better because now everyone is rallied around her. Now, nothing happened to Mike's own psychology individually. It's just because he's part of a whole connected system where there are constant patterns of messages that reshape his behavior, right? That could change it. Yeah, so it's constantly flexing, constantly changing. You know this too from your work. When you're working with a group of people at a restaurant, or you're working with a group of people, I don't know, some setting, and someone leaves and they hire a new person. What happens to the group? Are there a lot of shifts that take place in the group? Yeah, there's all kinds of reconnecting, regrouping the relationships that go on. And that's because the system is going to find a way to stabilize itself with this new arrangement of people and patterns that exist. So I have a friend, for instance, who just started to work in a new place. And my friend likes to work pretty steady through the day, and the place where he works is a place where people hang out a lot. They don't do a lot of work, right? They waste a lot of time. Well, now that system exists that way. If he comes in and tries to start changing things and working, finding work to do and producing more than everyone else, what happens?
They're not gonna like them.
Okay, they don't like him because
Setting an example.
cybernetics says he's disturbing the stability that the patterns we've established here. So the system will then communicate, will send messages to him to regulate his behavior. So what kind of messages will the system send
What's that?
to him? Somebody may say, yo, new broom, slow down, don't sweep so clean here, What else, what other kinds of messages might they send? Might find tools missing, right? Might find, damage to his locker, right? Are those messages? Right. All of those are messages from the system saying, you're not at the level we need you to be. So there's an input, which is your desire for more thing, which produces an output of backlash or sabotage from other people in various ways. Everything communicates. The knocked over locker, the damaged, the tools missing, someone saying, hey, don't do this, right? And so it all comes in. So this is a way of doing organizational analysis. It's a way of doing interpersonal analysis. So now this gives you a new theory, a new way of approaching groups of people or individuals, or dyads or small groups of people interacting with each other. Now let's go back here to this family for a minute. In the book, Griffin says that Stan's way of dealing with Mike is what? What's Stan's pattern of relating to Mike?
Like that he's just gonna this is a phase that he's going through and that he's just gonna get over it. Basically,
Okay.
that's how his attitude.
So Stan avoids it, Stan denies it, Stan doesn't address it. If he does address it directly, remember what Griffin said, he says he might send Mike the message, you need to get better for yourself. Do this for you, not for us. So it's a message that Stan would send. And what's Stan's goal in sending that message? What's the function of that message? Anybody else over here? What does he want to happen? Wants Mike to change. So, but then there's feedback. What's the feedback that comes back to Stan when he says, you need to change for yourself? Or I send you a message by ignoring and avoiding you. That's a message too, isn't it? And so Stan is constantly sending Mike messages. What's the feedback that Stan is getting from Mike? Is Mike changing? No. So the feedback is, this is not working. Your messages are not changing my behavior. So in a well-functioning system, if you send an input to create a change and the feedback comes back that there is no change going on, what would make sense for this to do then?
Find another formula.
Change the input. But what happens normally is he just keeps doing the same input. And the feedback comes back, if he's open to getting the feedback that this is not working, but he keeps doing the same thing, same thing, same thing, because he thinks this should work. Stan thinks this message should change the system. But it's not changing the system, but he doesn't change, he doesn't adapt to it at all. Now, why do you think Stan thinks that this message should work? Why is he so insistent that he keeps doing it, even when it's not producing what he wants? What do you think?
He's a parent. He's figuring this is the role of telling you what you need to do. And
Okay. I'm telling you what you need to do. This is the pattern. We'll call it pattern A. This should work. Now, part of what we would think about in cybernetics is the question of Stan himself was part of a family at one point. Right? Stan had a father, mother, brothers and sisters and brothers. This is the typical way of diagramming a family genogram. Have any of you done genograms? This is a useful thing to do, to track back your family lines. But in a cybernetic way, you ask, how did this family function? And how did this family function? How did this family function? Because all of those feed into the rules now that you have functioning in your setting. This is called an intergenerational transmission process. that your parents learned how to be a family from their parents, who learned to be a family from their parents. So the rules that they use, they didn't just make these up. They grew up with them. They observed them. And it may well have been that pattern A worked really good here. It may be that in Stan's family, his father would say, you need to do this for you. And it worked. So he's taking a pattern or a rule he learned in another system and bringing it into this system. And he's trying it out, and how's it working? It's not working. But he's not paying attention to the feedback. See, so this is what Weick says. In the chapter you read about Weick, about organizations and management, Weick says the way you do organizations is you just do something. And then you pay attention to the feedback. And then you adjust what you do on the basis of your feedback. So you keep trying things until you get the feedback that you want. And he says you can't know in advance what will work by just thinking about it or planning it. Why not, would you think? Why can't Stan just think and say, okay, this is the message that's going to work? Why is that not going to be adequate for the communication going on here? Because the reactions are highly complicated by the friends, by all kinds of things. So you don't know until you try and listen to the feedback what's going to happen. So Weick would say, in your organization, just do something, do anything as a manager. Make some pattern, make some set of rules, and then watch what happens and adjust them to make the organization function the way you want it to. But don't just sit or make a plan and impose a plan and then try to make everybody fit it, because it's probably not going to work that way. Because people are complex, relationships are complex. What is Sonia's part in this?
She like hides everything from Stan. She like hires like a lawyer and like
right, so she bails him out of jail. She gets a lawyer to cover it up. She writes excuse notes for the school. You know, so she makes all kinds of excuses. What does she think that's going to do?
Maybe I don't remember, but maybe make Mike feel guilty.
Okay, just think of this functionally. What function does she want? What does she want that message to accomplish?
Change.
Change. She wants him to change. Why does she think that message, we'll call that pattern B, why does she think that message will achieve that result?
The fact that she's doing a favor for him, that he would do a favor back to him.
Okay, so she has a rule in her mind that she probably got from going back in her family, that if I do a favor for you, you owe me a favor too. Maybe that worked there. She's trying it here. How's it working? It's not working. So the feedback to her is, your pattern is not producing, is not changing the behavior. What then does she need to do?
Change.
She needs to change the pattern, right? But this is not what happens, right? This is more often than not, Stan keeps doing this, she keeps doing that, because they sincerely believe on the basis of their experiences that those messages should work to accomplish the results. But what each person needs to do is to pay attention to the feedback and then say, okay, feedback is telling me I need to change the messages. So what kind of feedback mostly, what kind of change needs to take place in this system, this pattern of interactions here.
Mike probably needs a little tough love.
Okay, so then we'll call that pattern C. So we've tried pattern A, message A hasn't worked. We've tried message B, hasn't worked. Now we'll try message C. Okay, and message C is the tough love message, or the which is
Don't bail him out. Like,
okay.
Let him like
So
suffer a little bit in a sense.
you will feel the consequences of your behaviors. So if you come home and you throw up and you're laying in your